The news that a black woman was leading a case that could make history shocked many in the quiet halls of justice. A storm was brewing. A powerful corporation stood accused of destroying a community, displacing families, erasing livelihoods, all in the name of profit. The courtroom was packed, and at the center of it all was Elena Hayes, a black attorney determined to uncover the truth. But what she faced wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight against arrogance, corruption, and a system that seemed rigged from the start, including the presiding judge, a man with ties to the very corporation Elena was exposing. The stakes, an entire community's future hanging in the balance. What happened next stunned everyone in that room and sent shockwaves far beyond those courthouse walls. The grand double doors of the courthouse creaked open, and Elena Hayes stepped inside, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Her steps were deliberate, but her heart pounded with an urgency she wouldn't let show. She smoothed the front of her black blazer, scanning the courtroom packed with people, reporters scribbling in their notebooks, attorneys whispering among themselves, and members of the public sitting with a mix of curiosity and doubt on their faces. This was no ordinary case. It was Clayton versus Sterling Corporation, a lawsuit poised to expose decades of systemic racism and corporate greed. Elena had worked tirelessly for this moment, combing through thousands of documents, interviewing displaced families, and piecing together a case that could change the trajectory of history. Yet, as she took her seat at the plaintiff's table, she could feel the weight of every skeptical glance aimed her way. On the other side of the courtroom, Sterling Corporation's lead attorney, Arthur Edwards, adjusted his silk tie with the practiced arrogance of a man who had never lost a case. His tailored suit and smug expression exuded confidence. Behind him sat a small entourage of assistants and executives, all clad in dark, expensive suits. They didn't bother to hide their disdain as Elena placed her leather briefcase on the table and began organizing her papers. "Do you think she'll even last an hour?" Edwards muttered to one of his associates, loud enough for Elena to hear. Elena's hand paused briefly on a folder. She didn't look up, but her lips tightened. She had heard worse in her career, and every time, she had let her work speak louder than her detractors. The murmur of the room quieted as the courtroom doors opened again, and Judge Richard Stanton entered, his black robe flowing behind him. He ascended the bench with the slow, deliberate movements of someone used to commanding respect. His gray hair was neatly combed back, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the room with an air of superiority. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Elena stood as Judge Stanton glanced briefly at her, his gaze lingering just long enough to betray his skepticism. His expression hardened when he looked at her natural hair, tied neatly into a bun. She could see it in his eyes: judgment, dismissal, and perhaps even disdain. "Let's get this over with," Stanton said, settling into his chair. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Elena met his gaze, her face calm, her eyes steady. She had faced men like him before, men who underestimated her because of her gender, her race, or her unshakable determination. Elena stood and adjusted the microphone in front of her. She allowed a moment of silence to stretch out, letting the weight of the case settle over the room. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "This is a case about justice, not just for my clients, but for every community that has suffered because of unchecked corporate greed." Judge Stanton raised an eyebrow and leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. His smirk was faint but unmistakable. "Ms. Hayes," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "I hope this isn't going to be one of those emotional speeches. We deal in facts here, not sentiments." A ripple of laughter broke out in the audience, quickly silenced by a sharp rap of the gavel. Elena's jaw tightened, but she did not falter. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she replied evenly, "facts are exactly what I intend to present. The emotional impact of those facts is simply unavoidable." For a split second, Stanton's smirk faltered, replaced by something colder. As Elena continued her statement, she outlined the systematic displacement of families in the Greenwood district by Sterling Corporation. She spoke of the small businesses forced to close, the schools left underfunded, and the homes that were bulldozed to make way for luxury developments. The audience shifted uncomfortably as Elena described these atrocities with vivid detail, her voice steady and controlled. But Judge Stanton interrupted frequently, peppering her with questions designed to rattle her. Are you sure these figures are accurate? Do you have any first-hand evidence? Or are you relying on hearsay? Do you really expect this court to believe a corporation as reputable as Sterling would resort to such tactics? Each question was met with a calm, measured response. Elena's preparation was impeccable, and for every doubt the judge tried to raise, she countered with irrefutable evidence. Still, Stanton's dismissive tone set the mood. The tension in the room was palpable. Edwards smirked openly at his table, jotting down notes with exaggerated care, as if Elena's words were of little consequence. During a brief recess, Elena retreated to the quiet solitude of the hallway outside the courtroom. She leaned against the cold marble wall, closing her eyes for a moment. The voices of doubt lingered in her mind. Edward's mockery, the judge's condescension, the whispers of the audience. But as she opened her eyes, she caught sight of a young woman sitting on one of the benches, clutching a small child. They were one of the displaced families she was fighting for. The woman's eyes met Elena's, and a flicker of hope passed between them. Elena straightened, her resolve hardening. This case wasn't about silencing her doubters. It was about giving a voice to the voiceless. When the court reconvened, Elena was ready. She returned to the plaintiff's table, her expression calm but fierce. As the trial moved forward, she knew the road ahead would be treacherous. Judge Stanton and Arthur Edwards would do everything in their power to discredit her. But Elena also knew something they didn't. The truth was on her side, and she would not stop until it was heard. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the courtroom as Elena Hayes prepared to enter the second phase of her battle. The air felt heavier now, thick with anticipation and unspoken judgments. She adjusted her notes, arranging them meticulously, a quiet ritual that grounded her. Her hands didn't shake. She had trained herself for years to keep her nerves hidden, but the simmering fire inside her grew with every dismissive glance from Judge Stanton and the smug expression on Arthur Edwards' face. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Judge Stanton strode in, his robes billowing slightly. He didn't meet anyone's eyes as he sat, tapping his gavel sharply. "Let's proceed," he said curtly, his tone void of warmth. Elena rose slowly, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Her voice, calm but commanding, cut through the silence. "Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness to the stand, Mr. Marcus Foster." A man in his late 50s stood from the audience. His face was worn, his eyes tired, but his posture was steady. He was one of the many residents of the Greenwood district who had lost everything when Sterling Corporation moved in. As he approached the stand, Elena caught the way Judge Stanton's gaze lingered on him, an almost imperceptible sneer of disdain. "Mr. Foster," Elena began, her voice steady, "can you describe the impact Sterling Corporation's actions had on your community?" Marcus cleared his throat, his voice rough but resolute. "They tore us apart," he said simply. "My family lived in Greenwood for generations. It was a place where neighbors knew each other, where kids played in the streets. But then they came. First, they offered us money for our land, barely a fraction of what it was worth. When we refused, they brought in bulldozers. They said our homes were unsafe or unfit." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Elena let it linger for a moment before continuing. "And what happened to your family, Mr. Foster?" Marcus's voice cracked. "We lost everything. My wife and I ended up living in a shelter for months. My daughter had to drop out of college. All because they decided our community wasn't worth preserving." Judge Stanton leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Mr. Foster," he interrupted, "can you provide any documentation to support these claims? It's a serious accusation to say a corporation forcibly displaced an entire neighborhood." Elena interjected before Marcus could speak. "Your Honor, we have documented evidence of property condemnations, forged inspection reports, and financial records indicating Sterling Corporation's direct involvement in these actions. I'll be presenting them shortly." Stanton raised an eyebrow, his smirk faint but visible. "I hope these documents are more substantial than Mr. Foster's story. Let's proceed." Arthur Edwards rose with a calculated air of confidence. He approached Marcus with slow, deliberate steps, his polished shoes clicking ominously against the floor. "Mr. Foster," Edwards began, his voice oozing false politeness. "You mentioned that Sterling Corporation offered to buy your property. Is that correct?" "Yes," Marcus replied cautiously. "And you refused, even though they were offering you money for land that, frankly, wasn't exactly prime real estate, wouldn't you agree? Elena stiffened, but Marcus held his ground. It wasn't just land, he said firmly. It was our home. Edward smiled coldly. I see. So you made a choice to refuse their generous offer, and now, years later, you're blaming them for the consequences of your decision. A ripple of unease spread through the audience. Elena stood. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is badgering the witness and mischaracterizing the facts. Stanton waved a hand dismissively. Overruled. Let's allow Mr. Edwards to finish. Elena bit the inside of her cheek, but sat down, her expression unflinching as Edwards continued his cross-examination. Elena's mind raced. She knew this was their tactic, to paint her clients as reckless and irresponsible, to shift the blame away from Sterling Corporation and onto the very people they had victimized. When the cross-examination ended, Marcus stepped down from the stand, his shoulders slumped, but his resolve intact. As he passed Elena, she whispered, You did great. He nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude and lingering pain. Elena stood again, this time holding a thick folder. She approached the bench, her movements deliberate. Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence exhibit official inspection reports from Greenwood District Properties, all signed by inspectors later found to be on Sterling Corporation's payroll. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Elena handed the folder to the bailiff. Stanton leafed through the documents, his expression unreadable. And Exhibit B, Elena continued. Emails between Sterling executives discussing the displacement of Greenwood residents as a necessary step for their development plan. The tension in the room was palpable. Stanton's lips pressed into a thin line as he read through the damning evidence. For the first time, Edward's confident smirk faltered. As the court recessed for lunch, Elena remained at her table, organizing her notes. She caught Stanton watching her from the bench, his gaze cold and calculating. She could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just skeptical of her case. He was threatened by her presence, by the strength of her argument. But Elena also knew something else. The cracks in his facade were beginning to show. The sun had shifted by the time the courtroom reconvened, casting long shadows across the wooden panels. Elena Hayes sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight, her hands clasped over a closed folder. The atmosphere was thicker now, laden with tension that felt almost physical. She could sense the eyes of the room on her, some expectant, some skeptical, and others openly dismissive. Across the aisle, Arthur Edwards whispered something to one of his assistants, and they both chuckled quietly. The sound grated against Elena's resolve, but didn't shake it. She had been underestimated before by people smarter and more dangerous than Edwards. Today would be no different. Elena glanced down at her notes, reviewing the next phase of her argument. The evidence was strong, undeniable even, but she knew the truth wasn't always enough in a courtroom like this one. She had seen cases where facts were drowned out by rhetoric and where justice was a casualty of bias. Her fingers traced the edge of the folder in front of her, containing a key piece of evidence she had yet to reveal. Timing was everything. If she played her hand too soon, it could lose its impact. Too late, and it might be overshadowed by the opposition's theatrics. She took a deep breath, her mind steady. Not yet, she thought. All rise. The bailiff announced as Judge Stanton re-entered the room. Elena stood, her expression neutral as Stanton settled back into his seat. His demeanor hadn't softened. If anything, he seemed more impatient than before. Ms. Hayes, he said, his tone clipped. Let's move this along. Call your next witness. Elena nodded and turned toward the audience. The plaintiff calls Dr. Eleanor Vance to the stand. A collective murmur spread through the room as a woman in her early 60s approached the witness stand. Dr. Vance was a retired urban planner and one of the few insiders who had dared to speak out against Sterling Corporation's practices. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. After she was sworn in, Elena approached the stand, her movements measured. Dr. Vance, Elena began. Can you describe your role during the initial phases of Sterling Corporation's development in the Greenwood District? Dr. Vance adjusted her glasses. I was part of the planning team that evaluated the area for potential redevelopment. My role was to assess the impact on the community and provide recommendations. And what did you find? Dr. Vance's expression hardened. I found that the proposed developments would displace hundreds of families, destroy local businesses, and erode the cultural fabric of the community. I raised these concerns repeatedly, but they were ignored. Elena nodded, her voice steady. And why do you believe they were ignored? Because the goal was never to integrate the community into the development. The goal was to replace it, Dr. Vance said firmly. Sterling Corporation wanted the land, not the people. Judge Stanton cleared his throat, interrupting the moment. Dr. Vance, he said, leaning forward. You're speaking to intentions, not facts. Do you have any evidence to support these claims? Dr. Vance met his gaze without flinching. Yes, Your Honor. I kept records of internal memos, emails, and meeting minutes where these intentions were made explicitly clear. Stanton's eyebrows lifted slightly, though his expression remained guarded. He turned to Elena. Proceed, Ms. Hayes. Elena handed a folder to the bailiff. Your Honor, I'd like to submit these records into evidence. They include communications from Sterling Corporation executives discussing strategies to push residents out of the Greenwood district. Stanton opened the folder and began skimming the documents. His face remained impassive, but Elena didn't miss the slight tightening of his jaw. As Dr. Vance stepped down from the stand, Edwards rose smoothly from his chair. His demeanor was almost rehearsed as he approached the bench. Your Honor, I'd like to raise a concern about the admissibility of these records, Edwards said, his voice calm but firm. Without proper authentication, they amount to nothing more than hearsay. Elena was ready. She stood immediately, addressing the judge. Your Honor, the records were obtained through legitimate discovery and verified by forensic experts. I have their statements ready to submit if needed. Stanton glanced between the two attorneys, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he sighed. The evidence is admitted. Let's move on. Elena sat back down, but she didn't allow herself to relax. Edward's strategy was clear: stall, deflect, and undermine. He wasn't concerned with disproving her case, only with sowing enough doubt to weaken it. As the afternoon wore on, Elena introduced more evidence: photographs, financial records, and testimony from other witnesses. Each piece painted a clearer picture of the calculated cruelty behind Sterling Corporation's actions. But for every step forward, Judge Stanton seemed intent on slowing her down. He interrupted frequently, questioning the relevance of her evidence and often siding with Edwards' objections. By the time court adjourned for the day, Elena felt the exhaustion setting in. She gathered her notes slowly, watching as Edwards and his team left the courtroom, laughing and talking as if they had already won. That evening, Elena sat alone in her office, the room illuminated by the soft glow of her desk lamp. The walls were lined with legal texts and case files, but her eyes were fixed on a single document in front of her, a piece of evidence she hadn't yet introduced. It was her trump card, the culmination of months of work, but it was also a risk. If not handled carefully, it could backfire. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. She thought of Marcus Foster, of Dr. Vance, and of the countless families whose lives had been upended. Their voices deserved to be heard. Their stories deserved justice. When she opened her eyes, her resolve was clear. Tomorrow, she would turn the tide. The courthouse was a fortress of tradition. Its towering columns and marble floors whispered stories of battles fought long before Elena Hayes ever stepped inside. On this morning, the echoes seemed louder, more pressing. Elena walked through the main entrance with deliberate steps, the weight of her case pressing against her shoulders, but her resolve sharpening with every breath. As she entered the courtroom, she noticed the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. The audience was fuller than before, more reporters, more curious onlookers, and a handful of community members who had taken the day off to bear witness. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and she could feel the curiosity tinged with skepticism. All rise. The bailiff called out as Judge Stanton strode into the room. He seemed more irritated than usual this morning. His brows furrowed deeply as he adjusted his robe and settled into his chair. Let's get started, he said brusquely, his gavel cracking like thunder. Elena took her place at the plaintiff's table, her movements calm but deliberate. She was keenly aware of Stanton's gaze on her, assessing, dismissing. But today, she wouldn't let him or anyone set the tone. Elena stood. Your Honor, the plaintiff would like to call Mr. Martin Phillips to the stand. A collective murmur spread through the room. Martin Phillips was a mid-level executive at Sterling Corporation. His name had appeared in several of the documents Elena had submitted the previous day, and his presence in court was a surprise to everyone, including, it seemed, Sterling Corporation's legal team. Edwards shot Elena a sharp glance, his composure briefly faltering. He leaned toward one of his associates, whispering furiously. Martin walked to the stand, his suit crisp, but his face pale. He was in his early 40s, with a nervous energy that betrayed his discomfort. After being sworn in, he avoided looking at Edwards or the executives seated behind him. Mr. Phillips, Elena began, her voice measured. You were employed by Sterling Corporation for over 10 years, correct? Yes, Martin replied, his voice barely audible. And in that time, you held various positions, including project manager for the Greenwood redevelopment plan? He nodded, glancing briefly at Edwards before looking back down. That's correct. Elena stepped closer, her gaze steady. Mr. Phillips, you were privy to internal discussions and strategies regarding the Greenwood district, were you not? Martin hesitated, his hands gripping the edges of the witness stand. Yes, he admitted. Can you tell the court about those discussions? Elena asked. Martin's voice was shaky, but he began to speak. There were meetings, frequent meetings, about how to acquire the land in Greenwood. The executives, they didn't care about the people living there. It was all about profits. They wanted the district cleared as quickly as possible. Cleared, Elena repeated, her tone steady but firm. Did they use that word? Martin nodded. Yes. They called it clearing the area or optimizing the space. They even joked about it sometimes, saying it was like wiping a slate clean. The audience gasped, and the reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Elena pressed on. Did Sterling Corporation use unethical or illegal methods to achieve this clearing? Martin swallowed hard. Yes. They pressured inspectors to condemn properties that didn't need it. They forged documents to make it look like the buildings were unsafe. They even hired private security to intimidate residents who refused to sell. Judge Stanton raised a hand, his expression sharp. Mr. Phillips, are you aware of the gravity of the accusations you're making? Martin's eyes darted nervously to the judge. I am, Your Honor. But they're true. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Stanton leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. Ms. Hayes, do you have corroborating evidence for these claims? Elena stepped forward with a folder in hand. Your Honor, I have emails, meeting notes, and other documentation from Mr. Phillips that corroborate his testimony. These were obtained during discovery and verified by third-party experts. Stanton frowned but nodded. Proceed. When Elena finished her questioning, Edwards stood, his movements sharp and precise. He approached the stand with the confidence of someone used to dismantling witnesses. Mr. Phillips, Edwards began, his tone smooth but cutting. You've just accused your former employer of criminal activities. Would you care to explain why you're only coming forward now? Martin hesitated. I didn't feel safe before. But when I saw what they did to those families, I couldn't stay silent any longer. Edward's smile was cold. So, we're supposed to believe that after years of silence, you suddenly had a crisis of conscience? Or is it possible that Ms. Hayes offered you something to testify against your former employer? Objection. Elena interjected, her voice firm. Counsel is attempting to impugn the witness's character without evidence. Withdrawn. Edwards said smoothly, though his smirk lingered. As Martin stepped down from the stand, Elena felt a flicker of hope. His testimony had been powerful, and the evidence he provided was damning. But she also knew Edwards' tactics weren't about disproving the truth. They were about creating enough doubt to muddy the waters. The day wore on, with Elena presenting more evidence and witnesses. Each piece built on the last, forming a mosaic of greed and injustice that was impossible to ignore. Yet, Judge Stanton's interruptions continued, and his demeanor remained hostile. Near the end of the day, Stanton made an offhand comment that sent a ripple through the courtroom. As Elena submitted another piece of evidence, he sighed loudly and muttered, "More of this nonsense." The words were quiet, almost under his breath, but loud enough for the audience and the reporters to hear. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by hurried whispers. Elena paused, her hands still holding the evidence. She met the judge's gaze, her expression calm but piercing. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "I'd like the court record to reflect your comment." Stanton's face flushed. "Let's move on," he snapped, avoiding her gaze. When the court adjourned for the day, Elena lingered at her table, organizing her files. The audience filtered out slowly, their conversations buzzing with the day's revelations. As she packed her briefcase, one of the community members approached her, a middle-aged woman with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," the woman said softly, "for fighting for us." Elena smiled, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "This fight isn't over yet," she replied. But as she left the courtroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that the tide was beginning to turn. The cracks in Stanton's composure, Edward's brief moments of unease, and the growing support from the audience, all of it pointed to something bigger. Tomorrow would be a turning point. She could feel it. The morning broke quietly, the soft rays of sunlight casting a pale gold hue over the courthouse steps. Elena Hayes stood at the base of those steps, her leather briefcase in hand, gazing up at the imposing columns that framed the entrance. The building, a symbol of justice for some and oppression for others, loomed over her like a silent judge itself. She tightened her grip on the handle and exhaled slowly. Today would be decisive. Inside, the courtroom hummed with quiet tension. The audience had grown again, an undeniable shift in the energy of the room. Faces both familiar and new filled the benches, their expressions ranging from curiosity to hope. Among them, Elena spotted a small group of Greenwood residents, their presence a silent reminder of why she was here. Edwards and his team sat at their table, their usual smugness tempered by an undercurrent of unease. Martin Phillips' testimony and evidence had shaken them, though Edwards still exuded an air of confidence. Elena noticed the way his fingers tapped the table, an unconscious tell she had come to recognize. As Judge Stanton entered, his expression was even more pinched than usual. The murmurs in the room ceased instantly, replaced by the sharp crack of his gavel. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Elena stood, her movements slow and deliberate. She had planned today's proceedings meticulously, every detail carefully considered. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady, "the plaintiff would like to introduce a key piece of evidence. It is a memorandum written by Sterling Corporation executives outlining their strategy for acquiring land in the Greenwood district." She held up a sealed envelope, its contents neatly labeled. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, and Edwards immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting. This so-called evidence was not disclosed during pretrial discovery. Introducing it now is a clear violation of procedure. Elena turned to face him, her expression calm. "Your Honor, this document was obtained only recently as part of Mr. Phillips' cooperation. It was authenticated by independent experts, and its relevance cannot be overstated." Stanton leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he sighed. "I'll allow it. But Ms. Hayes, tread carefully. You're walking a fine line." Elena approached the bench and handed the envelope to the bailiff, who delivered it to Stanton. As the judge read through the memorandum, his expression darkened. The document detailed not only the corporation's plans to displace Greenwood residents, but also explicit instructions on how to manipulate local officials and falsify inspection reports. "This is highly incriminating," Stanton said, his tone clipped. Elena seized the moment. "Your Honor, this memorandum is proof of Sterling Corporation's deliberate and coordinated effort to disenfranchise an entire community. It shows clear intent to violate the rights of Greenwood's residents." The audience erupted into murmurs, some gasping audibly. Stanton slammed his gavel. "Order. I will have order in this courtroom." Edwards rose again, his composure faltering for the first time. "Your Honor, this is an ambush. The defense was not given adequate time to review or counter this so-called evidence." Stanton glanced at him, irritation flickering across his face. "You'll have your chance to respond, Mr. Edwards. For now, let's proceed." Edwards' jaw tightened, but he sat back down, his hands clenched into fists. Elena called her next witness, an elderly man named Andrew Quinn, a retired building inspector. Andrew had worked in Greenwood for decades before being pressured into early retirement. "Mr. Quinn," Elena began, "can you explain your role in the events leading up to the redevelopment of the Greenwood district?" Andrew nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the stand. "I was one of the inspectors they brought in to assess the properties. At first, I thought it was routine, but then the orders started coming in, properties to condemn, regardless of their condition." "Orders from whom?" Andrew hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. From Sterling Corporation. They told me if I didn't follow through, I'd lose my job. Stanton's eyes narrowed, his fingers steepled in front of him. Mr. Quinn, are you claiming that Sterling Corporation directed you to falsify inspection reports? Yes, Your Honor, Andrew replied, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. I didn't want to, but I had a family to feed. I didn't think I had a choice. The courtroom was silent. Even Edwards seemed momentarily at a loss for words. When Edwards finally rose for cross-examination, his usual confidence was replaced by thinly veiled frustration. He attacked Andrew's credibility, questioning his memory and motives. Mr. Quinn, isn't it true that you were forced into retirement because of poor performance? Edwards asked, his tone sharp. No, Andrew replied firmly. I was forced out because I wouldn't do what they wanted anymore. Edwards pressed harder, but the cracks in his strategy were evident. The audience watched with rapt attention, their faith in Elena growing with each passing moment. As the day wore on, Elena noticed subtle shifts in Judge Stanton's demeanor. His interruptions were less frequent, his tone less condescending. Though his biases were still evident, the weight of the evidence was beginning to chip away at his resistance. By the time court adjourned, Elena felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The tide was turning, and though the battle was far from over, the path forward seemed clearer. That evening, Elena sat in her office, reviewing the day's proceedings. The stack of evidence and testimony in her favor had grown significantly, but so had the pressure to maintain her momentum. As she flipped through her notes, her phone buzzed. It was an email from a journalist who had been covering the trial. Attached was a leaked document, a letter from Judge Stanton to Sterling Corporation, written years ago, offering his support for their revitalization efforts. Elena stared at the screen, her heart racing. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. But exposing it would be risky, and the implications could upend the entire trial. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Tomorrow, she would have to decide, play it safe or take the ultimate risk. The morning air carried an edge of unease as Elena Hayes stepped onto the courthouse steps. The leaked letter from Judge Stanton to Sterling Corporation had been running through her mind all night. She hadn't told anyone yet, not her team, not her witnesses, not even her closest confidants. It was a bombshell waiting to explode, but it came with risks she couldn't ignore. If she used it, she could discredit Stanton and potentially derail the trial altogether. If she held back, she risked letting systemic injustice go unchecked. She paused briefly, looking up at the grand courthouse facade. The weight of her decision pressed down on her shoulders, but she reminded herself why she was here, not for her own victory, but for the people who had trusted her with their stories. With that thought anchoring her, she climbed the steps and entered the courtroom. The atmosphere inside was sharper today, taut with anticipation. The courtroom was fuller than ever, and the Greenwood residents sat prominently in the audience, their eyes filled with quiet hope. The journalists were a sea of notepads and cameras, eager to catch every moment of what was becoming a landmark case. Across the aisle, Edwards and his team were visibly tense. They had underestimated Elena, and the cracks in their confidence were showing. Even Judge Stanton seemed more subdued, his usual air of condescension replaced by a quiet stiffness. All rise, the bailiff called. Stanton entered, his movements deliberate but less commanding. He settled into his chair, his gaze briefly meeting Elena's before looking away. Let's proceed, he said, his tone clipped. Elena stood, her heart pounding in her chest, though her face betrayed no sign of it. She had made her decision. Your Honor, she began, her voice clear and firm. Before we proceed with today's witnesses, I have a matter of critical importance to address. The room stilled. Even Edwards looked up from his notes, his brow furrowing. Stanton frowned. Ms. Hayes, this had better be relevant. It is, Your Honor, Elena replied. She held up a document, its pages neatly bound. Last night, I received a piece of evidence that raises serious concerns about the impartiality of these proceedings. The audience gasped softly, and Stanton's face darkened. Explain yourself, Ms. Hayes. Elena stepped forward, handing the document to the bailiff. This is a letter written by you, Your Honor, to Sterling Corporation several years ago. In it, you express your support for their redevelopment plans in the Greenwood district, plans which are the very subject of this case. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Stanton slammed his gavel, his face red with anger. Order. I will have order. Stanton's voice was sharp as he addressed Elena. Ms. Hayes, this is highly irregular and borders on contempt. You are accusing this court, my court, of bias without any substantiated proof. Elena held her ground, her gaze steady. Your Honor, the letter is proof. It shows a direct connection between you and the defendant, raising serious questions about your ability to preside over this case impartially. Edwards leaped to his feet. Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to derail the trial. The letter is irrelevant and likely fabricated. Elena turned to him. The letter has been authenticated by a forensic document examiner, Mr. Edwards. Its authenticity is not in question. Stanton's hand trembled as he gripped the edge of his bench. Ms. Hayes, you are walking a very fine line. What exactly are you asking for? Elena took a deep breath. I am asking for your recusal, Your Honor, and for this case to be reassigned to an impartial judge. The tension in the room exploded into chaos. The audience buzzed with whispers. The journalists scrambled to capture the moment, and the Greenwood residents exchanged anxious glances. Stanton slammed his gavel repeatedly. Enough, he bellowed. I will not have this courtroom turned into a circus. But the damage was done. His authority, once unshakable, now hung by a thread. After several minutes of chaos, Stanton called a recess, retreating to his chambers without another word. The audience slowly began to filter out, their voices hushed but filled with speculation. Elena sat at her table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She felt the weight of every eye in the room, but her focus remained unshaken. Edwards approached her, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. This is a dangerous game you're playing, Hayes, he said quietly. She looked up at him, her gaze cold and unyielding. The truth isn't a game, Edwards. It's the only thing that matters. When the court reconvened after the recess, Stanton's seat was conspicuously empty. A different judge, a woman with a calm and measured demeanor, took the place. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. The tension eased slightly, replaced by a sense of fairness that had been absent before. Elena stood to resume her argument, but this time her voice carried a new strength. Your Honor, I'd like to continue presenting evidence that demonstrates the harm caused by Sterling Corporation's actions in the Greenwood District. The new judge, Honorable Victoria Avery, nodded. Proceed. As the day progressed, Elena's evidence was met with careful consideration, her witnesses allowed to speak without interruption. The tide had turned, and for the first time, she felt the scales of justice beginning to tip in her favor. But she knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over, and the road ahead would still be long and fraught with challenges. As she left the courthouse that evening, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the steps. Elena paused, looking back at the building. The battle had shifted, but her resolve remained unshaken. Tomorrow, she would fight again. The morning air was crisp and still as Elena Hayes stepped onto the courthouse steps. Her breath formed faint clouds in the cold, but inside, a fire burned stronger than ever. Today felt different. Yesterday's revelation had shattered the carefully constructed facade of the trial, exposing its cracks for all to see. Now, with a new judge presiding and the scales of justice beginning to balance, Elena knew the weight of expectation rested squarely on her shoulders. She paused for a moment, clutching her briefcase, and allowed herself a deep breath. Behind her, the Greenwood residents gathered quietly, their faces a mix of hope and trepidation. She turned to them, offering a small, reassuring nod before heading inside. The courtroom felt like a different place altogether. Gone was the oppressive tension that Judge Stanton had wielded like a weapon. The new judge, Honorable Victoria Avery, brought a calm but commanding presence. Her reputation as a fair and meticulous arbiter had preceded her, and her demeanor was already shifting the dynamics in the room. As Elena entered, she noted how Edwards and his team sat stiffer than usual, their once unshakable confidence visibly eroded. The defense had been caught off guard, and their composure was now a fragile mask. All rise, the bailiff announced. Judge Avery entered, her black robe flowing behind her, and took her seat. She adjusted her glasses and surveyed the courtroom with a measured gaze. Good morning, she said, her voice steady but firm. Let's continue. Elena stood, her movements deliberate. Your Honor, I'd like to begin by calling an expert witness, Professor Lawrence Simpson, an economist specializing in corporate practices and community displacement. Professor Simpson was a tall, composed woman in her late 50s. She wore a tailored suit, and her gray hair was pulled into a sleek ponytail. Her presence commanded attention as she took the stand, her every movement precise. After being sworn in, Elena began her questioning. Professor Simpson, can you explain the economic impact of Sterling Corporation's actions on the Greenwood District? Professor Simpson nodded. Certainly. Sterling Corporation's practices systematically destabilized the local economy. By forcing residents out of their homes and businesses, they disrupted a functioning economic ecosystem. This led to widespread unemployment, reduced property values, and long-term financial instability for the displaced families. Elena leaned forward slightly. And in your professional opinion, was this disruption avoidable? Yes, Professor Simpson replied firmly. There were numerous alternatives that could have preserved the community while allowing for development. Sterling Corporation chose the path of maximum profit at the expense of human lives. Edwards' cross-examination was an exercise in desperation. He attempted to discredit Professor Simpson's credentials, questioning her methods and suggesting her conclusions were speculative. Professor Simpson, he said, his tone sharp, isn't it true that your findings are based on incomplete data? The professor didn't flinch. No, Mr. Edwards. My findings are based on extensive data, including records obtained directly from Sterling Corporation during discovery. Edwards pressed further, but his arguments landed weakly, his frustration growing evident. The audience watched with rapt attention, their faith in Elena's case deepening. During a brief recess, Elena sat alone at her table, reviewing her notes. The day was progressing well, but she knew the defense wasn't finished. Edwards was too experienced to crumble completely, and she had to be ready for whatever he might throw at her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a quiet voice. Ms. Hayes. She looked up to see a young woman, no older than 20, standing nervously near the railing that separated the audience from the courtroom floor. Yes, Elena said gently. I just wanted to say thank you, the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. My family lived in Greenwood. We lost everything. But seeing you fight for us, it means everything. Elena felt a lump form in her throat. She stood and walked over to the woman, placing a hand on her shoulder. This isn't just my fight, she said softly. It's ours, and we're going to win. The woman nodded, tears in her eyes, before returning to her seat. As the court reconvened, Edwards took the floor with a new tactic. He called Brian Palmer, a former contractor for Sterling Corporation, to the stand. Palmer was clean-cut, with a practiced demeanor that suggested he had been coached. Mr. Palmer, Edwards began, can you tell the court about your experience working with Sterling Corporation on the Greenwood redevelopment project? Palmer nodded. Of course. My role was to oversee the demolition of properties deemed unsafe. Everything we did was above board, following all necessary legal protocols. And in your professional opinion, Edwards continued, was there anything unethical or illegal about Sterling Corporation's practices? Absolutely not, Palmer said confidently. When it was Elena's turn, she approached the stand with calculated calm. Mr. Palmer, she began, you mentioned that all demolitions were conducted legally. Were you aware that several inspection reports used to justify those demolitions were later proven to be falsified? Palmer hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. I wasn't involved in the inspections. Elena nodded. But you relied on those reports to carry out your work, correct? Yes, he admitted reluctantly. Elena stepped closer, her tone sharp. And were you ever instructed to proceed with demolitions despite protests from residents or pending legal disputes? Palmer shifted uncomfortably. I followed orders. Orders from whom, Mr. Palmer? He glanced nervously at Edwards, but Elena pressed on. Was it Sterling Corporation's executives? Did they instruct you to proceed regardless of the consequences? Yes, Palmer finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Elena stepped back, her point made. As the court adjourned for the day, Elena felt a sense of quiet victory. Each piece of testimony, each new revelation, was building toward an undeniable truth. Outside the courthouse, the Greenwood residents gathered around her, their gratitude palpable. But Elena didn't let herself relax. The battle wasn't over. Tomorrow, she would face Edward's final attempts to salvage his case. But she knew the truth was on her side, and for the first time, she felt the tide had truly turned. The courtroom was silent. A tense, almost reverent stillness had settled over the room as everyone waited for the verdict. Elena Hayes sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The past weeks had been grueling, a battle of wit, evidence, and endurance. But now, the outcome rested in the hands of the jury. Across the aisle, Arthur Edwards sat stiffly, his polished demeanor marred by the faint lines of worry etched across his face. Behind him, the executives of Sterling Corporation sat motionless, their confidence eroded by the mountain of evidence Elena had presented. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The jury filed back into the room, their faces neutral but their eyes heavy with the weight of their decision. Judge Victoria Avery, seated at the bench, nodded solemnly. "Have you reached a verdict?" she asked. A young woman, the jury foreperson, stood and unfolded a piece of paper. "We have, Your Honor." The foreperson's voice was steady but carried the gravity of the moment. "In the case of Clayton versus Sterling Corporation, we find in favor of the plaintiff." The room erupted. Gasps, cheers, and even sobs filled the space as the Greenwood residents embraced each other. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their pens flying across notepads and cameras clicking furiously. Elena closed her eyes for a brief second, letting the relief wash over her. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Marcus Foster, one of the first witnesses, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Elena smiled, her own eyes glistening. "We did this together," she replied. Judge Avery tapped her gavel lightly, calling for order. The court awards damages to the plaintiffs in the amount of $150 million to be distributed among the displaced residents of Greenwood District. Furthermore, Sterling Corporation is ordered to fund a redevelopment program aimed at restoring the community under court supervision. The executives of Sterling Corporation sat frozen, their defeat palpable. Arthur Edwards' shoulders sagged slightly, the fight drained from him. Judge Avery continued, her voice firm. "This verdict serves as a reminder that no entity, no matter how powerful, is above the law. This court commends the courage of the plaintiffs and their counsel for bringing these injustices to light." Outside the courthouse, the air was electric. The Greenwood residents gathered around Elena, their gratitude pouring out in waves. She was pulled into hugs, her hands shaken over and over as cries of "Thank you" and "You're our hero" echoed around her. Elena stood in the center of the crowd, her heart full but her mind racing with thoughts of what still needed to be done. The verdict was a victory, but rebuilding Greenwood would take time, effort, and vigilance. Later that evening, Elena returned to her office, now quiet and dimly lit. She stood by the window, looking out at the city. The weight of the trial still lingered, but beneath it was a profound sense of accomplishment. On her desk lay the file she had compiled over months, pages filled with stories of loss, resilience, and hope. These weren't just documents. They were lives, each one a testament to the strength of a community that refused to be erased. As she closed her eyes, Elena thought about the young woman who had thanked her earlier, about Marcus Foster, and about every family who would finally have a chance to rebuild. In the weeks that followed, the verdict became national news. Headlines lauded Elena's work, and the Greenwood case sparked conversations about corporate responsibility and systemic injustice. Other communities began to organize, inspired by Greenwood's victory, and Elena found herself inundated with calls from people seeking her help. But for Elena, the true victory lay in the quiet moments. The sight of families returning to Greenwood, the sound of children playing in streets once thought lost, and the knowledge that she had helped restore hope to a place where it had nearly been extinguished. Months later, Elena stood in a small park in the heart of the Greenwood district. The community had come together to celebrate its first major milestone, the reopening of a local school. Laughter and music filled the air, and Elena watched as children ran past her, their joy a stark contrast to the stories of hardship she had heard. Marcus Foster approached her, holding a small plaque. "We wanted to give you this," he said, his voice full of gratitude. The plaque read, "To Elena Hayes, for bringing justice and hope back to Greenwood." Elena's throat tightened as she accepted it. "Thank you," she said quietly. As she looked around at the thriving community, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The fight for justice was far from over, but in this moment, She knew she had made a difference, and that was enough. The story of Elena Hayes and the Greenwood case became a symbol of resilience, justice, and the power of standing up to systemic wrongs. It was a reminder that even in the face of immense odds, the truth has a way of prevailing. For Elena, it was a victory not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts of the people she had fought so hard to protect. Justice had been delivered, and Greenwood's future was brighter than ever.